Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ISTC. We want to welcome the listeners we have online and then those here in the audience today for our sustainability seminar. My name is Nancy Holm, the seminar organizer. I wanted to mention that we have two remaining seminars after today, one on November 14th and then one on December 5th, which both of those will be at ISTC, but then we also broadcast those live. And all of our past seminars are archived on our website, www.istc.illinois.edu. Before I begin, I want to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones, and then also we'll have you hold your questions to the end, and we'll also, for those listening online, we'll have you type in your questions, and then we'll take those at the end too. I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker who we have via webinar from New York, Dr. Sherri Mason. She's an associate professor of chemistry at the State University of New York College at Fredonia and is also their environmental science program coordinator and sustainability coordinator of their academic community engagement center. I was very pleased to be able to have the opportunity to meet with Dr. Mason this summer when we were up in Chicago, and she was there for sampling on Lake Michigan. So that was great to talk to her. And we have with us here Laura Kamen, who's with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, who was also up there and actually went out sampling in Lake Michigan with some of Dr. Mason's grad students. And Laura will be available after this seminar for those here who may wish to talk to her about that experience. Dr. Mason's research group, as I mentioned, she's conducting some of the first research on plastic pollution in freshwater ecosystems in general and the Great Lakes more specifically. In addition to this research, her background actually is in atmospheric kinetics and the impact of combustion emissions. She has previously conducted research projects on the impact of forest fires on atmospheric chemistry, computational model development, computational chemical analysis, smog chamber studies, food waste analyses, and biogas production studies, so a wide range of interests. Dr. Mason graduated from the University of Texas at Austin before completing her PhD in chemistry at the University of Montana, where she was a NASA Earth System Science Scholar. So today she'll tell us about her research on pollution prevention or plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. So Dr. Mason, will turn over the speaker to you.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate that. Welcome everybody to share my screen. Okay. Welcome everybody to this, and I appreciate everyone's attendance, both online and in person. Well, I guess everybody's kind of online to me, but so thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my research looking at plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. I would like to start by actually going through my acknowledgments, which are usually saved to the end, but they're way too important to save to the end, so I want to thank my collaborators at the Five Gyres Institute, most notably Dr. Marcus Erickson. And the 2012 study that I'm going to be focused on today was supported through funding from the Burning River Foundation. So I really want to thank them for funding our work, as well as the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, who funded, partially funded the 2013 study that I'll talk about just at the very end, just kind of mention that. So, start by talking about exactly, just making sure that we're all on the same page, what exactly plastic is. This material is amazing, quite frankly. Synthetic, generally, most often they're synthetic polymers. Some of them are semi-synthetic, but they're based upon, kind of natural polymeric systems. Things like, proteins, our hair, our nails, DNA, all of those are naturally occurring polymers. And as a society, we really relied upon these naturally occurring polymers for many of our natural products, many of our consumer products, since the kind of dawn of civilization. And as a result of that, we're really the development of plastics really kind of came about from, ironically, I guess, from an environmental standpoint, in that, we were overusing these natural materials. So, I mean, we still have ongoing issues with, elephants being killed simply for their ivory in order to make things like, well, at that point in time, to make things like billiard balls. And it was really actually trying to find a replacement for billiard balls that led to the first synthetic plastic, which was celluloid. It was initially invented in 1862. It was registered as a product in 1870. And it was used initially widely as a replacement for ivory. We're probably more familiar with the term celluloid because it was the first movie films were made out of celluloid. And if you think about what you've heard from the celluloid days, it's a very explosive compound. So that was, you don't see it being used too much anymore. And although it was originally developed in order to make billiard balls, they actually never made billiard balls out of celluloid because it is explosive, and so when the balls would collide, you'd have a little bit of spark there. But the creation of celluloid is kind of considered the birth of the plastics industry, and the Bakelite was the first U.S. patent for synthetic plastic in 1909. So that's kind of when the industry started, but it wasn't, in this picture down here is some of the products that you can make out of Bakelite, all sorts of essentially jewelry, that were made out of Bakelite. It was a huge compound when it was first developed. But the industry of the plastics industry didn't really take off until World War II. Plastic is an amazing material because of the fact that it is so moldable, it's durable, it's very lightweight, and so it was used for these properties during World War II in order to transport munitions between their point of creation here in the United States over to Europe where they were being used. It would allow our military men to carry things, as they were doing their duties, and it was really during World War II that kind of the infrastructure for plastic industry was put into place in the United States. And so it was after World War II that then these companies turned their attention to the consumer market, and kind of led to this throwaway living that has become such a staple of our society today. So this is an image from a Life magazine ad, 1955. Basically, get mom out of the kitchen, let her, just have these throwaway products so that mom can have a better life outside of the kitchen, this idea of throwaway living. And that's really kind of what led to the taking off of the plastics industry. So this is a graph showing plastics generation from 1960 up to 2005, right? And so you see this just huge dramatic increase that's happened, not such an increase in the recovery of plastic, and therein lies the problem. So we're generating all this plastic. It's a very durable material. So these same qualities that make it such an amazing material from an industrial standpoint are also what make it an issue with regard to environmental concerns. It's extremely durable. It's extremely lightweight. Because it's lightweight, it can get carried for very large distances. It's very durable. It's not going to break down along the way. In fact, there's very few organisms that actually can degrade plastic, so it's generally considered not to be biodegradable. It is considered to be what is called photodegradable. So under the action of sunlight and water and these mechanical actions, the plastic will break into smaller and smaller fragments, but it will remain or maintain its molecular integrity because so few organisms are able to break down the polymeric material. And so really every single bit of plastic that has ever been created is still on the planet somewhere. And the question is where. If you go and look at EPA sites, they'll tell you, that 45% of it ends up in the landfill, 5% of it is recycled on average worldwide. That relieves about 50% that they will report as quote-unquote unaccounted for. It's not really unaccounted for at all. it's in our water. So you actually have, since the dawn of the plastics industry, you can find, reports in scientific journals talking about plastic in the water from the 1960s and 1970s. But it wasn't really an area of scientific research until Charles Moore, Captain Moore, making his way back from Asia back to the United States, happened through what is called the North Pacific Gyre. This is a gyre is formed from oceanic currents that kind of create this toilet bowl effect, right, where all the swirling currents will pull into one area. There's also an atmospheric depression that will literally push down on the water, so that as these currents turn cyclically, it will pull everything into one location, and that is kind of the eye of the storm. Think of it as that calm spot in the middle of the storm. And so most often, especially sailors, wouldn't be going through gyres because there's no wind. So it's not typically an area that most kind of boat trafficking would follow, but he happened to decide to go through the gyre. And he was noticing a bunch of larger plastic items, and it got him thinking. And he came back and kind of led the first real intense scientific investigation looking for plastic in the North Pacific Gyre. And that really led to the kind of the awareness of this issue. Most of the first studies, so this has really kind of been studied since the dawn of the 2000s as an area of scientific research, and most of those studies have really been focused on the North Pacific Ocean, which is definitely the largest collection of plastic in the world's oceans. But I've been collaborating with the 5 Gyres Institute. They've actually the first research group to go and study all 5 of the oceanic gyres. So we have the North Pacific Ocean, the South Pacific, the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. And they've done surveys on all 5 of the oceanic gyres in terms of the amount of plastic production or plastic pollution within those systems. I'm just going to show you a few of the images that they've taken from these. So this is a sample from the North Pacific Ocean. I was wondering what happened to my toothbrush. There it is. The South Pacific, the North Atlantic Ocean, so the Great Lakes, these would be kind of, the Great Lakes would be contributing to this kind of a sample that we would be taking out of the North Atlantic Ocean. So just keeping in mind that essentially we're upstream from this. The South Atlantic, and then the Indian Ocean. And there's my coffee cup from this morning. Just kidding. So this is an image taken from a 2012 study. This actually came out right before we went on our journey. It wasn't our expedition in 2012. It wasn't what led to the idea, but it was just kind of coincidental timing. So they're just highlighting in here in red the kind of the hot spots of plastic pollution. Yellow are areas where there is plastic pollution, but to a lesser extent. And then they identified in this article some hot spots, some areas where they that haven't been investigated in terms of plastic pollution, but because of the currents and the amount of people that live around these areas that might also have the kind of areas where you might find plastic pollution. And one of those was, in fact, the Great Lakes. Like I said, I had already had the idea to be looking in the Great Lakes. I had already contacted the 5 Gyres Institute, and we were literally just months out of going on this first expedition to do an investigation of plastic pollution in the Great Lakes when this paper came out. So it's just kind of coincidental that they identified the very thing that we were going to go and investigate. So this leads us to kind of provides the foundation for the Great Lakes. So I started a class. This is the U.S. Brig Niagara. It's the flagship for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's a War of 1812 vessel. It's accredited with winning the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813. So we just got done with the bicentennial year of that historic battle. I was contacted, I and a few other faculty from the Great Lakes region was contacted by the agency that runs this boat and asked to start an environmental sciences course 3-week class where we would study the Great Lakes while sailing this ship. We ran that class for the first time in 2011, and it was when I was on and running that class with some of my colleagues that I had the idea of actually surveying the Great Lakes for plastic pollution. So I was on the boat and I was just looking at the water and I was thinking about everything that I had read and heard and seen with regard to the oceans, and just wondering if anybody had looked in the Great Lakes for plastic pollution. When I got off the boat, I did a literature review and found that there was, aside from some beach line surveys, there was nobody looking in the open waters at the Great Lakes, and in fact there was very little done on any of freshwater system. And here we have the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world, and so this is kind of what led to my interest in doing this survey in the Great Lakes. And so 2012 was the first one. This is our science personnel on board. This is our Manta Trial, which you'll see in the water in just a second. That's me. This is Bill Edwards. He's my co-captain and running the course on the boat. This is Carolyn Box and Steve Wilson from the Five Gyres Institute. And then this is Lorena Rios Mendoza from the University of Wisconsin, who collected some of our plastics to do chemical analyses on looking at the ability of plastics to take persistent organic pollutants and absorb them out of the water onto the surface of the plastic. I won't actually talk much about her work, but she does amazing work. It's very interesting. These are the students who joined us on board for this first expedition, and then this is the entire crew. There's 50 of us on board, 20 in total. 20 of those are students, so about 30 crew members, and all of them tremendous help in us doing the work that we do. So I always like to give a shout out to the crew and thank them for all of their efforts. So this is what we do. This is a Manta Trial. It's called a Manta Trial because it looks like a manta ray in the water. It's an aluminum frame with wings that keep it on the surface of the water. So all of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is simply plastic that floats. Do keep that in mind because about half of the plastics that are manufactured sink and about half of them float. So here we're just looking at surface, what's floating on the surface of the water. Attached to our aluminum frame is a 333 micro mesh net. So we collect anything essentially that's bigger than 1/3 of a millimeter in diameter. So as it goes into the mouth, it flows through, and it's all collected within this cod end, detachable cod end that we collect our sample, and then we'll remove the cod end, transfer the sample into a sample container, and bring it back to the lab for analysis. In 2012, we surveyed Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. That just happened to be the path that the boat was taking for our 3-week course. We started up here in Lake Superior in Munising, Michigan, on Lake Superior, and then we traveled down and ended in Erie, Pennsylvania. So that was the 2012. In 2013, we went back and did a second survey of Lake Erie. We'll talk about the fact that Lake Erie had the highest counts of plastic in the 2012 study, so I wanted to do some more investigation. We also did a survey in Lake Ontario, and like I said, thanks largely to the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant, we were able to do a very extensive study in Lake Michigan. Please excuse me, I'm just getting over having a cold. So I apologize for all the coughing. Okay, so but I'm going to focus today on just the 2012 study because we don't have data yet from the 2013. So we took a total of 21 samples. This gives you an idea of what the samples look like when they come into the boat. You get a lot of organic material at the same time that you're collecting the plastic. I think this is very important because people will often ask about, well, can't we just clean the plastic out of the water? It's not really possible because it's so entrained with the entire ecosystem. To try and clean the plastic also means that you're going to be cleaning out a lot of organic material that is so necessary for the sustenance of the ecosystem. So, you know, in terms of how do we handle this issue, it's really about getting at the source of the problem as opposed to thinking about cleanup. This white thing here that looks like it could be a worm is actually coming from a cigarette pack. It's that thing that you, if you've ever been around a smoker or smoker yourself, it's that thing that you unwrap from the cigarette pack to open it. So then we bring it back to the lab and we do some cleanup on the samples, get rid of the organic material, leaving the plastic behind. So this is just giving you an idea then of the plastic that we might typically find in a particular sample after we've gone through the cleanup. You'll see some of it is bigger plastic fragments, some of it is smaller beads, so a variety of things. Some of it you can kind of get an idea of where maybe it came from. So this to me immediately makes me think of a ring around a plastic bottle, like a Gatorade or a water bottle, something like that, because of the edging that it has on it. Others are just going to be way too small to ever have kind of any idea as to a potential source. And then this is our overall data. So just looking at all 21 samples, GIS map showing the number of particles extrapolated, so particles per square kilometer for all 21 samples. Talking about them in a little bit more detail. So we took a total of 5 samples in Lake Superior. We got 8 samples in Lake Huron. But if you notice, based upon the size of the dots, on average, actually, Lake Superior numbers were higher than Lake Huron. That really kind of surprised me. I expected the counts to increase as we went down the system. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking at this point in time, if it has to do with the fact that in Lake Superior we tended to be much closer to land, while in Lake Huron we were pretty much going down the middle of the lake. And so they might be just more widely dispersed, whereas we might be collecting, you know, if we're closer to the land because of currents, because we're closer to the source, we might get higher counts than if we're looking in the center part of the lake. So that's one of the things that we're looking to kind of investigate in more detail as we continue on with this work. But that was one interesting finding. Regardless of these numbers, though, vast majority of what we collected was found in Lake Erie. So 90% of the plastic that we collected in total from the 2012 study was all collected in Lake Erie. You'll see, you know, samples 20 and 21 had our highest counts, on the order of 2 times higher than most oceanic samples. There's actually only one number in the reported in literature from oceanic studies that's higher than these counts that we found in the Great Lakes. So, you know, much higher counts than you see in most oceanic studies that we found. And granted, it's only 2 of our samples, but it's very interesting to find such high counts coming from the Great Lakes. So we want to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So here I'm showing a table of our data. What we do when we're analyzing our plastics, we separate them into size classifications. So remember, our net is 333, so it would be 0.333 millimeters, right? So we have a size classification that goes up to 1 millimeter, another size classification that goes from 1 up to 4.75 millimeters, and then a size classification that's bigger than 4.75 millimeters. Typically, this last column would be considered your macroplastics, and these other 2 columns would be considered your microplastics. In addition to doing size classifications, we also separate them based upon the plastic type. So a plastic fragment, this would be a hard plastic item that has some, like I said, fragmentation, some jagged edges to it. A film would be, you know, more like a food wrapper, right? Thin, flimsy type of plastic material. A foam would be like your polystyrene or your styrofoam beads, a soft foamed plastic item. Pellet would be those nicely rounded, perfectly spherical, hard plastic items. So the difference between a pellet and a foam is the foam is soft, the pellet is hard. The difference between a pellet and a fragment is that, I mean, both of these are hard plastics, but the pellet will be nicely round. And then we have line. which would be like a fishing line, so a thin line. This could also include fibers that come off of synthetic clothes when you wash them. Would also be considered in the line category. And what I want to talk about is comparing our numbers here in the Great Lakes to numbers obtained in the North Atlantic Gyre. Because remember, the Great Lakes are upstream essentially from what we're seeing in the North Atlantic Gyre. So I didn't do the North Atlantic sampling. This is my colleagues at the Five Gyres Institute. So we're comparing the numbers that we took from our sampling expedition here in the Great Lakes in 2012 to those obtained during one of their expeditions in the North Atlantic Gyre. And what was really interesting to us is, in the North Atlantic Gyre, the majority of what you find is about 1 to 5 millimeters in diameter. And this is really true of most oceanic plastic debris. They tend to be, about in that 1 to 5, most often they're in that 1 to 5 millimeter category. I want to contrast that to what we found in the Great Lakes. So 80% of what we found in the Great Lakes was actually smaller than that. I'm pointing this out because this was actually really surprising to me. I expected going into the Great Lakes to actually see more coming into this greater than 4.75 millimeter category. I expected to find more macroplastics. The reason being is that the story we've been telling since the awareness of plastic pollution in the oceans, and the fact that the United Nations estimates that 80% of the plastic that we find in the oceans is coming from land. It's not from boating. About 20% of it is coming actually from the shipping industry, boating, but 80% of it's coming from land. So the story we've told is that proverbial plastic bag you see floating in the trees, or the plastic bottle you see lying along the side of the road. These things get accidentally released into the environment. They make their way down a storm drain. They end up in a river, and that river flows into a lake, and the lake flows into the ocean. And during this entire path, the plastic is photodegrading. It's getting, because of the action of mechanical action, the sunlight, the wind, the water, these things, cars running over it, these things are breaking the plastic into smaller and smaller pieces. So if the majority of what we're finding in the oceans is 1 to 5 millimeters, then I thought if we're looking upstream from the ocean, we would see bigger pieces of plastic. But instead the opposite was true. The majority of what we found were even smaller fragments of plastic. And so it really made us wonder about the sources. So this gives you an idea of these plastics, what we're finding in the smallest size classification. You'll notice that a lot of them are these perfectly spherical, highly colored little balls of plastic, quite, beautiful in their own way. And so, what is the source of these? The fact that, they're so perfectly spherically round means that this isn't, something that was bigger and broke down, but more likely something that was released into the water as a microplastic itself. So just showing you a few different images of these, and this really here makes it easy to see, one, how highly colored many of the particles are and how perfectly spherical. So, like I said, we're really thinking about, well, what are the sources of these? To investigate this question about source, I took our samples and I looked at them under what's called a scanning electron microscope. So this is just a really high-powered microscope. It allows us to do elemental analysis as well as looking at them just under a microscopic. It lets us look at the texture of them as well as the elemental analysis. So this gives you an idea of some of the images that we can get. This is a scanning electron microscope image in a its typical arrangement where it's doing secondary electrons. So scanning electron microscopes use electrons, a beam of electrons that they shine onto your sample, and the electrons hit the sample and cause the emission, generally most often the emission of electrons from that sample, and then based upon the scattering, or the emission pattern of the electrons coming off, you can get a nice image of the surface of your sample. Another mode that you can operate a scanning electron microscope oftentimes, depends upon your detector, in is what's called a backscatter mode. So here, rather than looking at electrons essentially being conducted through, here we're looking at electrons that are being scattered or reflected off the surface of our sample. And you'll notice that these particles out here don't really change in their appearance, but this inside particle does. And this has to do with the fact that this inside particle is highly inorganic in nature as opposed to these particles, which are very organic. So these essentially are plastics, and this thing is not. So that kind of led us to wondering more about what it was. So I did an analysis, an elemental analysis, seeing that it's an aluminum silicate particle. And was able to go and find a source. So this was the bottom elemental analysis is taking from a corporation who does analysis on coal ash. And you'll see that, and I apologize, I had to squish it to get it all onto the same slide, but I wanted to try and line up the silica peaks, the aluminum peaks, the oxygen peaks, the carbon peaks, so that you can get an idea that, you know, what we're seeing in our sample, this upper spectrum, is very much the same specimen as what you would find as what they analyzed, this known compound that they analyzed here, which is coal ash, fly ash coming from a coal-fired power plant. So basically we ended up finding that 8 of our 21 samples contain some amount of ash, coal ash or fly ash. Coal ash coming from essentially the inorganic remnants of burning coal, so oftentimes referred to as bottom ash. Okay, this is the stuff that just can't burn and is very inorganic in nature. Fly ash, fly ash is formed from the condensation of gases that are being emitted out of the smokestack, and because it's formed from a condensation, you'll notice how beautifully spherical in nature that these particles are. So like I said, about 20% of our, in 8 of our samples, on average, 8 of our 21 samples had, on average, about 20% ash within their samples. So we had to adjust our numbers. So if you've been at all kind of keeping up with the mass media attention of this study, you'll see that the numbers have changed in time, and that's a result of this SEM analysis. So that tells us about some of the particles. Like I said, some of our particles were very inorganic in nature, but then we had these others, perfectly spherical particles. This is, again, in backscatter mode, that are very much organic in nature. Just showing you a few different images of some of the particles that we looked at, just to give you an idea. So again, you know, you see some texture to them. Probably you'll see, actually, if you can look closely, that you have diatom formation on many of these. It looks like little hairs growing on them. So, so they're definitely, you know, somewhat degraded because of their being in the water, but they're definitely very spherical in nature as well. And so this, again, made us kind of think, well, what could be a possible source for this perfectly spherical little microbead directly into the Great Lakes, and got us thinking about personal care products. So these are a couple of facial scrubs that you can buy on the market, and they list microbeads, right, gently exfoliate. And if you look at the ingredients on the back, you'll see that polyethylene, which is a plastic, is listed as one of the ingredients. So basically the microbeads that are used to exfoliate or scrub your skin, take off the dead skin, is made out of plastic. These then, when you're done washing your face, right, would be washed down the drain, go into a wastewater treatment process, but because they are so small, they would make their way straight through the wastewater treatment process and be released directly into the Great Lakes. And we actually are doing some wastewater treatment plant studies showing that this is very much true. It's very possible for these plastics to make their way straight through the wastewater treatment process. So again, these are a couple of beauty products that we took off the shelves. I washed off all of the cleanser, just leaving the micro beads, and then we looked at them under a scanning electron microscope. And, you know, just kind of a visual comparison to, again, these last two images are images from beads that we found in the Great Lakes, comparing those, again, this is a visual thing, to those that we took out of the beauty products. And we see that there's, you know, definitely some comparison. These were actually both blue beads. The bottom two images were both two blue beads. This was from a product that we took off of the store shelf. The left one is a blue bead that we found in the Great Lakes. Elemental analysis for these two actually matched up very nicely in terms of they both use cobalt to produce that nice blue color, as well as some other inorganic substances for the coloration. So you can, you know, essentially use the color of the material to kind of provide a fingerprint for what their, you know, possible sources of them. So kind of just in conclusion, you know, what we're thinking in terms of the sources of the microplastics that we're finding in the Great Lakes. Some of the samples that we took in 2012, we refined our method, so we shouldn't be getting this ash in as we're processing our samples for 2013. But for 2012, some of the particles that we found that were initially identified as plastic within our samples were actually found to be coal ash or fly ash. But the vast majority of what we're finding is coming from essentially consumer products, right? Either photodegradation of larger plastic items, referring you back to this image I showed you earlier from sample 14, where you can see that these are obviously fragmented, coming from things like water bottle lids or maybe, you know, a plastic, you know, cup or something. And then exfoliating beads from consumer products such as facial scrubs, toothpaste, body washes. You know, image on the left being from a facial scrub that you found on the market, and the one on the right being the microbeads that we're pulling out of the lake. The question I often get then is what is the potential impact of this? You know, if we're finding them in the lake, well, what does that mean? Okay, so we have plastic in our water. What does that mean? This is the only image I have concerning the Great Lakes. This was actually sent to me. Somebody read an article about the research I was doing, and he had caught this fish in Lake Ontario, Mexico Bay, Lake Ontario. And he sent me the image, and right around the center of this fish, you'll see essentially a ring from probably like a Gatorade bottle, I'm guessing because of the orange color. Okay, so the fish had obviously at one time been much smaller, you know, playing with this orange ring, got it caught on, and the fish grew around the rest. And so these are kind of some of the impacts that you see upon organisms in the water. This is the only one I have from the Great Lakes, but I'm going to show you some images coming from oceanic studies. So my colleagues at 5 Gyres, one of their sailing expeditions going from California to Hawaii, they started collecting fish to eat, and they gutted their fish, and these are I think it was 19 particles of plastic that they found within the gut of the fish that they caught in the ocean. We've started doing a fish gut analysis looking at fish in the Great Lakes. And, you know, analyzing their guts and intestines for plastics. You know, just, you know, we haven't put this into a paper yet. It's just the beginning of this, but we have definitely found fish with plastic from the Great Lakes. So we're in the process of doing that. So these are the kinds of things. So basically, you know, the plastic, smaller plastic items is actually more of a concern for me than larger plastic items because it's very easy to be ingested by organisms that live in the water. When they're ingesting plastic, it can satiate their hunger, and so they will stop eating. They will starve to death. We also talked about the fact, Lorena's work, looking at the adsorption of toxic chemicals onto the surface of the plastic, which then, once the plastic is ingested by the organism, those chemicals can desorb and go into the fatty tissues of the organism. And many of these compounds are carcinogenic. This is from Chris Jordan's work. He's an environmental artist looking at birds, albatross from the Midway Atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You know, all the birds there, as they're decomposing, reveal that their stomachs are full of all sorts of plastic items. I think this is from the Nature Conservancy. Turtles are some of the most highly impacted by oceanic plastic debris because they see plastic bags. They look like jellyfish in the water, and the turtles will eat them because their primary food source is a jellyfish. So basically, you know, what's the potential impact? The impact is that whatever in the water eventually is in us, right? We're all connected through water. So what are the solutions? As I said, you know, it's really about thinking about, well, what are the sources of the plastic, and then trying to eliminate those sources. So here we have products that contain polyethylene microbeads, but you can also go to the store and instead buy things that use apricot shells or cocoa beans as exfoliants instead of plastic. So you can change what you buy. We're not going to be able to buy ourselves out of this problem, however. So, you know, think about how to reduce your use of plastic. It's certainly, I think it would be very, very, very difficult to eliminate plastic from your life just because it is so prominent. You know, we're all probably sitting on chairs right now that are made out of plastic, but we can certainly do things to reduce our use of plastic. So shake the habit of plastic bags. Remember to bring your reusable bags to the grocery store. If you forget, you know, how I fixed my my bad habit of forgetting my reusable bags is I would have to buy a reusable bag every time I forgot to bring mine with me. And once I accumulated 50 reusable bags, I started remembering to bring them into the store. Ban the bottle, right? So I've made a personal promise to myself that I won't buy you know, plastic bottles of water. No matter how thirsty I am, I will survive until I can get to a water fountain. And generally speaking, I have my coffee cup on me so that I can fill it with water as I go through my day. Bring your own utensils. I actually carry bamboo or metal utensils in my backpack and in my purse so that, you know, even if I'm at a party with some friends and they put out plastic utensils, I can bring my own, and I never have to use plastic utensils. And for the record, they work a whole lot better anyway, the reusable utensils versus plastic. Don't take it to go, or at least not in plastic. Anytime I'm at a restaurant and I need to take food to go, I'll ask them to wrap it in aluminum foil because that can be recycled. Don't litter, save the critters. So, you know, think about where your waste is. Make sure you properly dispose of your waste that you do create. And then change the laws, right? You'll see many more of these bag fees and bag bans happening throughout the world. Many states have bottle fees to encourage people to bring their bottles back. Ultimately, though, it comes down to corporate responsibility, extended corporate responsibility. So, you know, generally this idea has been applied to, say, electronics, where now, at least in New York State, you know, any company that sells electronic devices, they have to accept and recycle electronics that their customers bring back, whether they sold it or not. So if I have, you know, an old VCR from the 1980s, I can take it to a Best Buy, and Best Buy has to accept it, and they have to recycle it. So basically, you're relying upon the corporations who sell the stuff to take care of the waste that's associated with it. And by doing that, then the corporations are much more viable. They're much more, kind of aware of, we need to think about what we're making and make sure that it's very easy to recycle and take care of. Next steps. So in 2013, then we went back in the lakes. In 2012, we surveyed 3 of the 5 Great Lakes, but and the reality is we took a total of 21 samples. It was not an extensive sampling campaign. It was just a first sampling campaign. And so really in 2013, I wanted to I had 2 main goals. One was to get into the other Great Lakes that we had missed, so Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan, and the second was to get more samples. So thanks to the Burning River Foundation and the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant, we were able to take some additional samples in Lake Erie, do some sampling around Lake Ontario, and then do a really extensive sampling campaign in Lake Michigan. We have about 60 samples, I think it's 60 to 70, somewhere in there, samples just from Lake Michigan. So it's going to be our best surveyed of the 5 Great Lakes, and that is largely because of the financial support that we were given to do that campaign. So I'm very appreciative of that. We took a total of, so in 2012 we only took 21 samples. In 2013 we took nearly 100 samples between these 3 lakes, and my students are currently in the process of processing those samples. I have an image here from, actually this is from Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. This is our 40th sample in Lake Michigan. This is a cigarette pack wrapper from around a cigarette pack that was found in that sample. So, so more work to do. And with that, I will turn it over to questions. Hopefully I did pretty good on time. Can people hear me? I can't hear anything.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sherri. Let's give her a round of applause. We're going to take some questions now from online, and then we'll open up for any questions here. So Beth, do we have some? Yeah.
Partially crystalline polymers contain a microstructure feature called spherulites. Is it possible that polymers, the polymer decomposition has removed the matrix but left some of the spherulites?
Certainly. Certainly, as the plastic degrades, I would think that would be very possible. One of the many things I want to do is to look at more at how plastic degrades in freshwater systems. And I have a colleague, Plastic, he's a polymer chemist up at the University of Buffalo, that we're in conversations in order to do some more kind of studies looking at that type of, kind of responses to that type of question.
Okay. Our second question is the problem our use of plastic, or rather the release of plastics into bodies of water? Presumably recycling or clean combustion pyrolysis could handle the waste system.
My perspective is that the problem is both. I started by saying that plastic is an amazing material, and I do fully believe that. And I think that there are instances where using plastic makes sense. And I think that there are many instances where using plastic doesn't. If you're talking about, single-use items, plastic utensils, plastic water bottles, plastic bags, these are things that you're intending to use once for literally minutes generally. On average, a plastic bag is used for 12 minutes. But that plastic material is designed to last forever. I mean, that's like the whole, if we go back to looking at, our, properties, what makes plastic so attractive is the fact that it's so durable. So then why are we making products that are intended to be used once and then thrown away out of something that's out of a material that's intended to last forever? that kind of logic is not sustainable. If we're thinking about how are we going to sustain our society, we need to be thinking about the long term. And so that kind of mentality, that just doesn't work. Recycling plastic is the least recyclable material out there. Glass is kind of the complete opposite of that. You can recycle a glass bottle into a glass bottle infinitely. But you can't even take an aluminum can and recycle it into a full aluminum can, because in the recycling process, some of that metal oxidizes, vaporizes, and is lost, quote unquote, essentially into the ecosystem. But that, with plastic, it's because of the number of plastic monomers and the combination of mixing the plastic monomers with plasticizers, with additional additives in order to make the infinite number of plastic items that are on the consumer marketplace, it's very, very, very difficult to recycle plastic. And so recycling is not really the answer. It's not going to answer our problem here. Burning plastic, I've had a couple of people ask me about this. I'm a combustion expert. I have a real hard time picturing an incineration for plastic that isn't going to release extremely harmful compounds like dioxins and PAHs and other very known carcinogens. So I don't really see pyrolysis or burning of plastic waste as a viable outcome for how can we handle this. So I really think we need to strike it at its source. So it's about thinking about the products that we're making out of plastic, what is their lifetime, and if it's supposed to be used once very quickly, then you don't make it out of a material that's intended to last forever.
Thank you. Do we have another question, Beth?
Yeah, we have one more online. So
okay.
We want to take some here.
Right. We'll take a few from the audience here now. Do we have someone? John, could you come up by the microphone so everyone can hear online as well as
Can you tell us how many kilometers your sample is taken over, or how many minutes or hours the manta is out in the water, so we get an idea of what's involved with taking a sample?
Yeah, so in 2012, we would deploy our Manta Trial for an hour at a time. In 2000, because of the number of plastic particles that we were collecting, in 2013, we reduced that down to a half hour. So we do half-hour trials. So we're surveying, 1 to 3 kilometers per deployment. And it's the actual sampling isn't, I don't know how to say it. It's intensive and it's not intensive. I mean, when we were in Lake Michigan taking those 70 samples of Lake Michigan, that last image I was showing here, these green dots, these were all the samples. I was up every 2 hours. So, that might mean midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, that I was, being woken up every 2 hours. It was like having a baby all over again. Taking these samples to collect, so it's somewhat intensive in terms of how frequently you're throwing out the Manta Trial in order to get that good coverage. And then, the biggest intensity with the sampling is coming back to the lab and processing those samples. Each sample takes us roughly about a day to process. And so, you can imagine then if the 100 samples, how many days, working 5 days a week, and I don't have students in here, all day long because they are undergraduate students, so they go to class, and I have them in the lab, some on the order of about 10 hours each a week. I have 6 students, so that's how we get some good sampling done. So of the 100 samples that we collected, by the end of August when school started, we've processed somewhere in the order of 45 of those since the start of the school. And that, I mean, that did include some startup time to get them all trained on how we go about processing them.
Okay. Do we have anyone else here have a question? Wait, did you come up?
You mentioned that the one of the source for the plastic pollution is from the coal, fresh, ash. I just wondering, this is from the air disposition, or how do you make sure this is from the coal, from the ash, not maybe from some practiced combustion, So how do you make sure this is from the coal, fly, ash?
It was based upon looking at the elemental analysis and thinking of that as essentially a fingerprint for,
So you use the fingerprint to identify?
Yeah. It seemed the most likely, source of these. I mean, basically, the elemental analysis, really kind of highlighted the source. You're not, this isn't, not how to try to say this, as opposed to other, you're thinking of like other combustion byproducts?
Yeah, I saw that this may be from the air disposition, so I just
some of them are fly ash, so they're formed from condensation, and so atmospheric deposition of fly ash onto the water, and then we collect it.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, some of it is from atmospheric deposition, absolutely.
A big source of your pollution was the microbeads and facial washes and stuff. Do you intend to have you talked to Neutrogena, or do you intend to talk to them? And if not, why not?
Actually, so the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, which is a collection of mayors from over 100 mayors from throughout the Great Lakes area, just put out a press release. So that's what I'm trying to pull up here. I'm assuming that y'all still can see my screen. They just put out a press release including a fact sheet. So, not myself. This is where it's great that I work with Five Gyres Institute. I'm a scientist, so I'm a teacher. Primarily I'm a teacher and a scientist. So, teaching and my academic responsibilities keep me very, very busy. So I don't have time to kind of do the advocacy, but I love working with Five Gyres because they do. That's what they do. They're a science advocacy organization. So their whole intent is to do scientific research and then advocacy work as a result of those. So they've gone and spoken to Johnson & Johnson, to L'Oreal, to Colgate-Palmolive, and as a result of our work, many of these companies have agreed to phase out. I think that they've been in contact, or they've tried to get in contact with Neutrogena. I think that they haven't gotten a response back from them yet. But many of these companies have promised to phase out the use of microplastics. And then, like I said, this collection of mayors has actually put out a press release where they have contacted the EPA. They've contacted Environment Canada. They're asking for legislation to be created to require, to essentially to not allow, to ban the use of microplastics in these consumer products, and then also asking these government agencies to do more research into the threat of microplastics within the Great Lakes.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Okay,
anyone else here have a question? Sure. We'll take one more question from here, and then we have a few more online. Do you have time to stay online, Sherri?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I think you mentioned that Lake Erie displayed the highest level of contaminants. I'm wondering what you attribute that to.
So sorry, I'm just trying to pull up that image. We attribute that to two things. One is that Lake, all of the water from Lake Superior flows into Lake Huron. You get plastic from the people who live around Lake Huron in addition to what flows into it, and then that flows into Lake Erie. So I think part of it is accumulation from stuff that's flowing in. By that count, then, we might expect that Lake Ontario would have even higher counts, and we'll see how the numbers come out. So I think part of it is accumulation. Lake Erie is also the most heavily populated of the Great Lakes. So it may just be that we're closer to the sources as well. But I think it's a combination of those. I think that samples 20 and 21, we saw especially high counts. If we look at Great Lake, at the currents, the lake currents, so unlike the oceans, we don't really get gyres here, although you have almost it's almost like a gyre along the southern end of Lake Michigan. So we did some pretty extensive sampling within that region. We're expecting to see higher counts in southern Lake Michigan than northern Lake Michigan, again because of lake currents. So these two samples in Lake Erie, sample 20 and 21, these had high counts, and we think that that's largely because of the lake currents. This is, you see Long Point right here in Canada comes off. You also have some topographic happening along the bottom of the lake, and it causes all of the lake currents to kind of push together right along here. And so we think that part of the reason that these counts were so high is just because we were sampling in the right space, where the right spot where the lake currents were being pushed together. And so rather than the plastics being kind of more spread out along the surface throughout across the entire lake, they were kind of being pushed together, and so it's almost like we were sampling a river as opposed to sampling a lake. And it's actually as a result of this that when we were going from Lake Erie into Lake Huron this year, I did a sampling in the Detroit River, in Lake St. Clair, and in the St. Clair River as well. Just kind of curious to see what the counts look like in a river system as opposed to the lake system. It may be because of the turbulence of all the water funneling together that we get lower counts because it gets pushed down temporarily. But we'll have to just see how the numbers turn out.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure. We'll take a couple more of the questions we have online. Beth will read those. Okay.
How many wastewater treatment plants and where are you sampling, and when will those results be available?
We're sampling 5 wastewater treatment plants. We've got one in Cleveland. We have 2 where I live here in Fredonia, New York. So Dunkirk and Fredonia, 2 sister cities. So I'm able to sample 2 here. And then I have a colleague out at Plattsburgh, New York. And Plattsburgh is, it would empty out into the Lake Ontario. So we're looking at wastewater treatment plants that dump into Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, a total of 5, and we're monitoring those in real time. So we're actually taking the effluent right after it's gone through all of the wastewater treatment and right before it gets dumped into the lake, and we're running that through our series of filters, going from 1 millimeter down to actually 0.125 millimeters. So we're even looking at smaller plastic particles coming out of the wastewater treatment than we're able to collect in the lake. That's just because of the amount of organic material that's in the lake, especially Lake Erie. So we're actually able, we're finding, and the reason I mentioned the fibers coming off of clothing is we're actually finding in that smallest classification, so between 125 micrometers and 355 micrometers, we're finding fibers coming off of people's clothes when they're doing their laundry. coming through the wastewater treatment process, and then we're collecting them in our samples. When is that data going to become available? When I have a chance to get it all written up. I have about 5 different projects going on right now, and so it's always just a matter of finding the time. And I wanted to get some additional analyses done. So, you know, we started this project in the spring. Spring was a lot of methods development, so we're really kind of just getting it going. So maybe I can write it up next summer or next fall and start get that out.
Yes, the next question is, will there be any sampling below the surface to capture plastics that sink?
I'm very interested in doing that too. Actually, I was contacted by the USGS. They're going to be doing some sampling actually in a tributary that dumps into Lake Michigan. They were going to do, it's called benthic sampling, when you're collecting the sediment off of the floor, and he offered to send me some of, you know, to do some additional benthic sampling and send me those samples. I also wrote a grant with Patricia Corcoran, who's up in Canada, and she's interested in doing, she's actually a geologist. She was the one who she's done beachline surveys along Lake Huron and Lake Erie. She was the only researcher I found that was doing anything with regard to plastics in the Great Lakes when I started looking into this in 2011. So her and I just wrote a grant looking to do some benthic sampling in Lake Erie for that reason. Yeah, so it's definitely in my mind curious, you know, about, you know, if this is what we're finding on the surface, what are we going to find on the sediment? Because things like cigarette butts, which are, you know, well known to be like the most common plastic item along our beaches, those sink when they get into the water. Cellulose acetate, which is the polymer that makes up the cigarette butt, is more dense than water, and so those would sink. So I'm really kind of curious what we're going to find on the floor.
Okay, we've got several more questions. If anyone, of course, here needs to leave, feel free. Otherwise, we'll just continue if you have a few more minutes.
I can probably give you about 5 more minutes, but I have somebody at a 2 o'clock meeting, so he's waiting out there for me. So.
Okay, we'll run through 2 more questions then. Okay.
Okay.
Is there such thing as green plastic, in quotes?
They have been working on biodegradable plastics. You can actually find some on the marketplace. Their level of degradability, so their ability to biodegrade, is very questionable. They're based upon cellulose and starch, so they're coming from, you know, things like switchgrass and, you know, corn that they're using to make the plastic, and so therefore they say that they're biodegradable. They have to be under, you know, to be honest, I've thrown some of them in my compost pile, and they're still there, and that's like 3 years ago, and they're still there, because they really have to be under very high temperatures. So I would have to like kind of bury them and keep them buried at the center of my compost pile in order to see them degrade. And my compost pile probably honestly isn't big enough. So we might be able to grade them if we were all like living in San Francisco, where all food waste is, you know, is run through a composting process. But most cities don't compost, and so the ability of these to degrade, you know, in a landfill, they're not going to degrade at all, because that's, you know, the whole purpose of a landfill is actually try and limit degradation, so you don't get like the seepage and the gas evolution and things like that. You know, there's attempts, I guess, to make quote-unquote green plastics, but at this point in time, it's there's not really good options. I think just more work needs to be done in that area.
Yeah. Do you have any idea how quickly plastics are accumulating in the Great Lakes from looking at past research compared to your findings?
There is no past research. We're the first one to ever do a survey of plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. So we're providing the baseline. And that's why it was really important to me in 2013 to get into our other 2 Great Lakes, so that, you know, between these 2 years we have a really good baseline of what's out there. And then as we go forward, with initiatives like, what the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, things like that that maybe are helping to decrease plastic emissions into the Great Lakes, hopefully in time we could see the numbers go down. But there's no way for us to kind of look back in time and look at our numbers versus somebody who did it before, because it's just never been done before.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sherri, for all of your presentation as well as answering all of our questions, and we look forward to hearing more about the results later. So another round of applause.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, yeah, we'll have some people who want to email you some questions, so is that all right? I'll let them do that.
Okay, yep. My email is mason@fredonia.edu, so you're welcome to email me, but if I get an onslaught of emails, just understand it may take me a few days to get back to you.
Sure. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Take care.